Our Denver Broncos training camp position preview continues as we take a look at safety. There's a crucial battle for that number 3 safety spot behind Justin Simmons and Kareem Jackson. Who has the advantage between Caden Sterns and P.J. Locke? Plus, who are some young up-and-comers that Broncos country needs to know about? We tell you that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, senior Broncos analyst at Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. He is the site expert, predominantlyorange.com. We also cover the Broncos for the Locked On Network and 9 News. Broncos country, once again, thank you for coming in clutch when we need you the most, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, whether you listen on your favorite podcast provider or whether you watch us on YouTube. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Sayre, my friend, our training camp position previews continue here today. Yesterday's episode was a great one. We talked about cornerbacks, specifically the battle between Bless Austin and Michael Ojemudia of Broncos country. If you missed that, make sure you go check that out on your favorite podcast provider or on YouTube. You can watch us on your computer, your TV, or your smartphone. But now we focus in on the secondary. So one thing we're going to do, we're going to talk about the players' position battles to watch, and we're also going to project maybe how the final roster may shape out at that position. So Sayre, my friend, let's waste no time. Let's get into it right here, right now. Opening things up here at the safety position here at training camp, there is one crucial battle. It could be probably one of the more important battles to have an eye on this upcoming season, and that is between who gets a safety 3 spot between Caden Sterns and P.J. Locke.
It's kind of a similar position battle to what we talked about in the cornerbacks episode between Michael Ojemudia and Bless Austin. It's one of those things where you've got a guy like P.J. Locke who's kind of been cutting his teeth on this roster for a couple of years, kind of like Bless Austin had been with the Jets and the Seahawks. P.J. Locke really been cutting his teeth on special teams, getting in on the action when he can. Then you got the young guy with a lot of upside in Caden Sterns, who showed it just flashes all throughout last season, right? I mean, he'd get onto the field and it felt like if number 30 was on the field, he's making the play, right? And picking off passes, getting sacks. I mean, he was doing it all. And Lamar Jackson, I mean, he wasn't out there against any sort of like, Joe Flacco type guys in the pocket. He was out there against Lamar Jackson getting sacks. So definitely this is an intriguing position battle to me, Cody, and something that, we talk about, and we'll talk more on this episode as well. How many defensive backs do the Broncos keep? In addition to that, I think like how many can they put on the field at one time, because this is such a fun position group here at safety where you've got guys that can be true weapons for you on the back end.
Well, I feel like a lot of the conversation is based on, okay, who's going to get after the quarterback at the edge rusher position? But I really feel like Ejiro Evero has so much flexibility as a defensive play caller if the Broncos transition to this dime look, because he can send defensive backs after the quarterback, extra pressure. And it seems like we're going to get a little bit of an aggressive style, kind of what we saw in Los Angeles, maybe a little bit more aggressive than what we've seen with Vic Fangio, because granted, Vic Fangio usually sent 3, sometimes 4 guys. It was rare we ever saw him send 5 or 6 guys on a blitz. And we know Evero has said, hey, if you can't get home with 4, we're going to send 5. If you can't get home with 5, we're going to send 6, so on and so forth. And a lot of these safeties will factor into that. I imagine Caden Sterns, P.J. Locke, whoever wins this competition, will be utilized heavy in that hybrid role here. But here's a little bit of comparison. I tell the tape here when you look at Caden Sterns and P.J. Locke. These are very interesting because they're kind of very different players in a sense of how they've been used. Caden Sterns, as we mentioned, impressive in a limited sample size with the Broncos last season as a rookie. Was a guy who was making plays all throughout training camp last year. Was the first guy to get an interception in training camp. So that was one thing that stood out there. But for him in the regular season, he had 2 starts, but he played and appeared in 15 games for the Broncos last year. He played 32% of the team's defensive snaps throughout the season and 34% of the team's special team snaps. And in his limited sample size, the 2 interceptions, 5 passes defense, and also 2 sacks and 28 total tackles, there could be a little bit more room for him to grow on the special team side. When you look at P.J. Locke, very minimal impact on the defensive side of the ball, was not utilized as much, only played 3% of the Broncos' defensive snaps in 2021. However, 83% of the team's special team snaps. And Sayre, I feel like regardless whoever wins this battle, the other guy will be on the roster regardless, even if Caden Sterns wins. P.J. Locke will be a roster lock, in my opinion, pun intended there, because of his value on special teams. He's a core 4 guy, and he played every role. He is that special teams captain here. But I would be very intrigued to see maybe what it's going to be like for P.J. Locke. Could he get more reps? Sayre, granted, keep this in mind. Last year in the preseason, who did we see start at safety? We saw Caden Sterns and P.J. Locke, and they looked pretty dang good.
They did, and I think that's going to be something to monitor, as the offseason activities were kind of rolling along. That was one of the things that I found interesting, was that PJ Locke was out there with Justin Simmons when Kareem Jackson wasn't at OTA. So that's definitely an intriguing storyline to keep an eye on as we get into training camp and into these different positional battles, but also at the back end of this roster, right? There's so many safeties. Like we talk about underrated additions. We talked about guys all offseason. We've covered almost all 90 players on this show, if we haven't actually covered all 90. But you look at the safety position, you got guys like J.R. Reed, who came in as a free agent acquisition, had some time with the Los Angeles Rams, and Jamar Johnson, a 5th-round pick in last year's draft that everybody kind of thought at the time he was drafted maybe a better prospect than Caden Sterns. Certainly was beloved by like Pro Football Focus and different outlets like that for his coverage abilities. So what's his preseason and training camp going to look like? And what are his reps going to look like? And of course, the rookie Delarrin Turner-Yell in that mix as well. Like, how do you keep all of these guys on the team? I don't know if you can do that, Cody. And I think that's one of those things that's going to bring out really a great competition and really get that cream to rise to the top. That's exactly what you want to see over the course of training camp. You don't necessarily always want to have an established, hey, here's our 5 guys that are making the team, and that's just it. And we might have a couple of practice squad guys behind. I think the Broncos maybe have 6, possibly 7 NFL caliber safeties on the team right now.
Well, and it's going to be hard too. Like for Jamar Johnson, he's one of these players that I have as my spotlight. He has to hold off J.R. Reed. He has to hold off Delarrin Turner-Yell, because for the Broncos last year, we saw with George Paton, he went back-to-back safeties with Caden Sterns, Jamar Johnson, and then this year, Delarrin Turner-Yell. So for me, it's like, okay, what is it? Because I think we were expecting a little bit more from Jamar Johnson last season, but he has the traits. And one thing Vic Fangio said, he needs to become a more consistent tackler. He is a ball hawk. He finds ways to get after the football, but can he translate that? I have a feeling, regardless of how this all plays out, I think Delarrin Turner-Yell is a roster lock because of his draft position. He'll play special teams as a rookie. Heck, you know what? He may even rise up the ranks to get a little bit of a hybrid role in certain packages here. But I think really Jamar Johnson is going to be the guy to watch for me, in my opinion, as to who he has to hold off and maybe try to secure a roster spot here. And granted, there's always an opportunity after final roster cuts get made that a couple of these guys can go to the practice squad as needed by this Broncos team if they don't get picked up by another NFL team. But definitely a lot to monitor here. I'm super excited about training camp. I'm specifically excited about watching the different rotations that we see at safety and whether or not these guys mix in with the starters a little bit. It's something we're going to keep our eyes on. Obviously, at the end of the month at the UCL Training Center, when the Broncos report for training camp, first day the fans can be in attendance watching practice on the berm is July 27th. We'll be there at training camp to provide you coverage here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. But Broncos country, coming up here in just a moment, we're going to talk about the entire room. We're going to look at all the players at the safety room. We're going to identify some of the key storylines for each player, including the starters, and a little bit more coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about BetOnline.net, the sponsor of today's episode. Locked On Broncos. BetOnline.net remains your number one source for all your betting needs and sports information this upcoming season. You can find all the latest sports developments, odds, league reviews, and news, including Major League Baseball, NFL futures, as well as other things like MMA, boxing, and UFC action, all in one place at BetOnline.net. They're also your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this upcoming season. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. As we continue our preview of the Denver Broncos safety room for training camp, let me just say real quick, Broncos country, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, for all your daily Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. Every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. You can get this podcast wherever you get your podcast. You can watch us on YouTube as well. Thank you so much, Broncos country. Sayre, continue on here today, looking at this safety room here. We talked about some of the position battles to watch, but let's actually break down the room here. And I always like to do it, categorizing it based on returning faces who were at training camp last year for the Broncos and new faces who are entering the fray here today. Returning faces, pretty similar. I mean, it's going to be headlined by Justin Simmons, who over the weekend was actually voted by according to ESPN, amongst peers and NFL executives and coaches, as the top safety in the National Football League, which that recognition that you get from peers, executives, and much more, I think is very, very valuable. He came in at number 1, which is a huge step for him, and was quoted as saying his ability to be everywhere. He plays in the box. He can play the middle of the field. He's not afraid to do the dirty work. And I think that's a lot of high praise and a lot of respect here for Justin Simmons. So the Broncos have him returning, headlining it, and obviously he's been the quarterback, the face of the defense here, where Russell Wilson is now the face of the offense. And I really love, too, that behind the Broncos documentary, the latest episode where they had he and Russell Wilson sitting next to each other talking about leadership. I tell you what, like these young guys, I think in that safety room, even on the defense, can look at Justin Simmons and say, you know what, this is a guy we can learn so much from, because Justin Simmons has exemplified from his rookie season all the way to now tremendous growth year after year after year. He's identified weaknesses in his game and he's attacked them and he's made them his strengths. So that is what we call evolution of a very good football player, man. And I tell you what, Justin Simmons, Kareem Jackson returning, that's exciting.
It is. And isn't it great to have somebody else say that Justin Simmons is the best safety in the NFL? I think a lot of Broncos fans say that and truly believe it. But then there's this other sect of fans that maybe even within Broncos country, or certainly other AFC West teams, that's like, well, you only say that because he plays for the Denver Broncos. And obviously that's not the case, right? We're saying that because, I mean, I like to think we're good at watching football. I think if that's a thing, Cody, can you be good at watching football and analyzing what we see? I think there's definitely, yes, and that's the case. So honestly, it's great to see that from a different outlet and from, like you said, from peers, other executives in the league. And even if it was just George Paton's opinion, remember when George Paton first got to the Denver Broncos and he was evaluating the roster and how he just oohed and awed over Justin Simmons and talked about how, hey, he's going to be here for a long time. Like, we don't have to worry about him going anywhere. I think that is a great sign of respect, considering George Paton was with the Minnesota Vikings previously. There's respect all around the league, rightfully so, for Justin Simmons. So you get him back, obviously, and you get Kareem Jackson back. So maybe the best safety duo in the NFL. I mean, we talk about the Broncos having arguably the best running back duo in the NFL. Maybe they have the best safety duo as well. And you love to see that. And then you get the other guys back, Caden Sterns, Jamar Johnson, P.J. Locke. It's a tight group, I feel like, Cody.
Yeah.
I feel like those guys really like playing together. I feel like they really like each other. And like you said, with Justin Simmons and Kareem Jackson, these young guys are learning so much from those veteran players. And the guys that Justin Simmons got to spend a year with the no-fly zone. Kareem Jackson has been in the league since 2010 as a former first-round draft pick. So these are two great guys for the young players to learn from.
I'm actually working on a story where I'm going to interview Justin Simmons and Kareem Jackson about their evolution as leaders, how, who they learn from and how they've carried that on and even have done things better since being put in that position to help these young guys. And I tell you what, when we've talked to guys like P.J. Locke, Caden Sterns, they've said nothing but great things about what it's like to be in that room with these two guys. And even these new faces like Delarrin Turner-Yell and J.R. I mean, these guys can benefit a lot being new guys coming into a room and seeing how these guys do business, how they conduct themselves. That will benefit them and these young guys continuously as they grow. But, Sayre, here's also another angle, too, that we can look at with this safety position group. There was at one point this offseason through free agency where Kareem Jackson said he hadn't heard from the Broncos. And we started to believe that, hey, maybe it's looking like George Paton isn't going to reach out to Kareem Jackson or to Bryce Callahan and bring these guys back. Then all of a sudden, once again, in the final hour, we see Kareem Jackson return on a one-year deal once again to come back to Denver. It's a place that he's wanted to. But I think we can maybe make the assumption this could be Kareem's final year in Denver. Heck, maybe it could be his final year in the NFL, depending on what he wants to do next. But I imagine they're keeping him around to help build and mold some of these guys continuously. Look, I don't feel like you have to thrust Caden Sterns into a starting role next to Justin Simmons or P.J. Locke right away. These guys can still learn a lot from not even being the feature starter, but learning from Kareem Jackson. We mentioned how good Kareem is inside the locker room. And lately I've seen some narratives on Twitter, Sayre, and it's definitely made me kind of question, like, hey, where did they come from? Where people think that Kareem Jackson is a weak link on the Broncos defense. I think he's a very monumental part. He puts his body on the line. I mean, he is a physical force the way he comes up against runs and passes. But I tell you what, like, Kareem was really kind of the back end outside of Justin Simmons, the heart and soul of the defense. Like, he was the glue guy. And he was also one of those guys that was the underrated X factor. I go back to that Dallas Cowboys game when the Cowboys would run trips on one side and a single receiver on the other. We call that 3-by-1. He was playing the middle of the field, but his eyes were on the number 3 receiver there, because if that number 3 receiver went vertical through the middle or across, Kareem is responsible for picking him up, while Ronald Darby has man-to-man coverage on the right-hand side of him there. The Broncos really diagnosed their game plan in a way where Kareem Jackson was probably the Swiss Army knife that they needed in that matchup in particular. So I don't see the narrative where he's fallen off. I don't think his play has fallen off either for him to move to the safety position. I think he's done tremendously well. But, then again, people see certain things. They'll look at certain stats that are very misguiding. They'll look at PFF grades for justification. But the reality is, just watch the tape, watch what he does, and then try to pick apart. If you watch one play like 4 or 5 times, 6 times, even that, like, that's something I do sometimes. You start to pick up on maybe what his responsibility is, or maybe how it changes based on what formation comes out. I mean, what the receiver runs, you can see what his role is. And it's easy to pick up if you know football and you love football. And if any of you want to learn the game a little bit more, I'm happy to help teach along the way here. But I do feel like that Kareem, the narrative towards him has definitely been kind of negative this offseason, which to me, Sayre, has been very, very surprising.
It is surprising. He's one of those veteran guys that I think you can rely on for the most part in every phase. Like, he's going to come up, he's going to hit hard, he's going to be in the right place and position more often than not. Not to mention how many guys start off their career at one position and get a second and third, fourth contract at a different position, right? He was a second contract player at corner, and then he obviously got a contract with the Broncos, who wanted to move him to safety, and then he gets another contract with the Broncos to come back as a safety again. So multiple contracts at multiple positions. He deserves a lot of respect for what he's done in the league, but he's still playing, like you said, at a high level, making that transition. And we've talked on this show a number of times, just how creatively could the Broncos get with their usage of Kareem Jackson, right? I mean, last we saw Caden Sterns kind of lining up in that dime defensive back role, blitzing a little bit more, playing, doing different things out there. Maybe we see Kareem Jackson transitioning into that kind of a role. We know he's that heat-seeking missile out there on the field. So getting him opportunities to rush the passer, getting him opportunities to blitz, to make plays behind the line of scrimmage where his aggressiveness can be highlighted instead of maybe limited, I guess, if people want to say that. And maybe he's not the best on the roster in terms of like the too high looks. Maybe Caden Sterns is ready to take the reins there. Maybe P.J. Locke. But I think Kareem Jackson definitely has a huge role to play on this defense, which has been very good over the last 3 years.
Well, Broncos country, what are your thoughts on how the Broncos may plan to utilize the Broncos safety units this upcoming season? Let us know in the YouTube comment section down below. But coming up here in just a moment, Sayre and I, we're going to project the Broncos safety room. How many players are they going to keep on the active roster going into this season, and who will it be? You get that and much more coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about rockauto.com, the sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. And ladies and gentlemen, as you know, if you need anything for your vehicle, rockauto.com has everything that you can be looking for, whether it's brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, or even brand new carpet for your vehicle. Whether it's for your classic or your daily driver, rockauto.com has everything that you could be looking for, all within one click, where you can choose the brand, specifications, year, make, model, and even the prices that you prefer to find all the parts available for your car or truck today. Plus, it's easy and convenient. They deliver directly to your doorstep, and you don't have to pay an arm and a leg at a local chain auto parts store or a car dealership when you can get them cheaper at rockauto.com. So go to rockauto.com right here today, see all the parts available for your car or truck. Tell them the Locked On Broncos sent you in their How Did You Hear About Us box. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, we'll be focusing on projecting the Broncos safety room here on the active roster in 2022. But just real quick, once again, Broncos country, thank you so much for tuning in and making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite podcast provider, or whether you watch us on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. Sayre, let's project the Broncos safety room here. Now, on yesterday's episode of the show, when we projected the cornerback room, we factored in and we said, hey, you know what? They're probably going to carry 6 total cornerbacks on the active roster. There's space on the practice squad for maybe a couple of the younger guys that could develop. The safety position, I feel like when we project it, though, is going to be a lot more difficult as the Broncos transition to this dime look. I mean, we can almost assume that you're going to have 3 safeties on the field alongside 3 corners in dime. So that means that you need 3 backups to those guys. Plus, you need a little bit extra help in case one of those guys gets banged up. So, Sayre, I mean, how many players do we project the Broncos will keep here on the active roster?
I'm thinking 5, Cody. That's what I'm at. We talked in the cornerbacks episode, maybe 11 defensive backs on the roster is kind of a good, I don't necessarily want to say over under. I kind of feel like that's about the sweet spot, but maybe you keep 12. I think that's that's maybe the maximum, right?
Yeah.
If they keep fewer defensive linemen or off-ball linebackers or something like that, maybe you do see them keep 12 defensive backs, but 5 safeties in total. And I think this is where the conversation gets very, very interesting because, like you mentioned before, with Delarrin Turner-Yell, we know the top 3-4 safeties. It's going to be Justin Simmons. It's going to be Kareem Jackson, Caden Sterns, not going anywhere. P.J. Locke, I think we've outlined the reasons why he's kind of a, for lack of a better term, lock for the roster because he is that special teams guy. And also to throw into the hat the fact that he was out there when Kareem Jackson wasn't at OTAs, not Caden Sterns. So maybe PJ Locke has an edge for that 3rd safety spot. And then you have this whole situation here with the rookie Delarrin Turner-Yell, the 2nd-year player Jamar Johnson, and the free agent pickup J.R. out there to round out your depth at the position. That's where things get very interesting to me because it's you mentioned it, the draft status of Delarrin Turner-Yell. Does that get him a roster spot? Or like last year with Jamar Johnson, do we kind of see maybe the team try to stash him this year? Like J.R. I think we know very little about him other than the fact that he played a little bit with the Giants and the Rams last season, familiar with the coaching staff, very intriguing from that vantage point. And then obviously Delarrin Turner-Yell, who was selected this year with the new coaching staff in place. So you can't help but think maybe did one of the coaches come to the Broncos front office and say, hey, we really like this guy and his ability to fit in our defense. So that's where the competition is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good projection, 5. And I think that the players that you mentioned, it makes sense because it's very hard. And this is always the tough part about, I think, being a personnel player and a personnel person inside the Broncos front office. You have to make some tough decisions. Like you have to let some good football players go and you have to hope that maybe you can pick them up on waivers after the whole fact there. But yeah, I mean, I agree with the top 4. I think it's a foregone conclusion. You got Simmons, you got Kareem. I think you have Sterns and you have Locke, but really it's that competition, that 3-way competition between Delarrin Turner-Yell, J.R. and Jamar Johnson, which I think for Jamar Johnson, as you said, he's the player that I have my eye on to see if he can fend off Delarrin Turner-Yell. Like, could they stash Turner-Yell on the practice squad potentially? I think there's always a possibility for that. Could they stash J.R. on the practice squad at some point? They certainly can do that. It just depends on what some other teams around the NFL do, but it's very strategic in the sense that, let's say there are some teams who really want a young safety who maybe has some of these tools. Maybe there's some NFL teams and evaluators that had high grades or like different higher undrafted rookie free agent grades on some of these players and maybe say, you know what, maybe we can snag this guy. I mean, it's certainly possible. Could the Broncos look to trade somebody during the process of roster cuts from all the way from 90 to 53 when it's all said and done after that 3rd preseason game? It's a really tough problem. But, I think the Broncos depth here at safety, Sayre, it's a great problem for them to have because you have good players there. I think that obviously if something were to happen to Justin or Kareem, it wouldn't be the same when you have a guy like PJ Locke or Caden Sterns jumping on there. If like both those guys had to start over those 2 guys, if they were injured, it certainly wouldn't be the same, right? But they're pretty dang good players from the standpoint that they can come into this defense. They can execute what the Broncos want them to do. Will the play level be at the high level that it is with Justin and Kareem? Remains to be seen, but the flashes are there. The potential is there with some of these guys behind Simmons and Kareem. But I think even more importantly as well, Going back to the flexibility process, you mentioned it in the last segment. I think it's a very good thing to kind of visualize if you're a Broncos fan. When the Broncos go in that dime package, I mean, they can move Kareem into that nickel, that other slot position opposite of K'Wan Williams. And not only do they have a guy who can cover, they have a guy who can play the run very aggressively inside there to be some extra help for the down lineman when you do kind of take out an extra body there and you replace him with a guy who can cover. So you want a guy who can be able to do that. I mean, I look at last year, Sayre, and Caden Sterns played a lot of that slot role, that dime role that we're talking about here with Kareem. So, I think really that third safety spot will be competing for that. But the Broncos have so many options to be creative, to move guys around in this defense. And like I said, I think that we're going to see guys play, and we're going to see guys have different impacts at different levels of the field, which, like I said, is a good problem to have. Broncos country, do you agree or do you disagree with Sayre and I that we believe that they'll hold 5 safeties on the active roster coming into the 2022 NFL season? And if so, who are your final roster projections for the Broncos safety room, starters, backup players, and key depth? Let us know in the YouTube comment section down below. But that will wrap up today's episode. Lockdown Broncos here on your favorite podcast provider, also here on YouTube. Tomorrow's episode of the show, Sayre and I, we're going to take a look at the wide receiver position. We're going to talk about some of the key matchups there. Travis Fulgham, where is he standing against Kendall Hinton? What about Montrell Washington, and much more? We take a look at the Broncos wide receiver depth heading into training camp and our position preview continuation series here on the Locked On Broncos podcast.